The missing decorations, it all started about a week before Halloween. My family goes all out every year with decorations. Giant inflatables, fake tombstones, strobe lights, you name it. Our yard looks like a mini haunted attraction, and it's something the whole neighborhood looks forward to. But this year, things got weird. I first noticed it when the life-size skeleton that usually sits by the mailbox was gone. I thought maybe the wind had knocked it over, but when I checked the bushes in the neighbor's yard, nothing. Then, a couple of days later, the witch's cauldron disappeared. It was heavy, too, so it's not like someone could have just casually walked off with it. I started feeling uneasy, like someone was watching me every time I stepped outside to check on the decorations. That'd be why the time Halloween night rolled around, half of our stuff was missing. My parents were annoyed, thinking it was just some pranksters, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to set up a camera, one of those small, motion-activated ones, facing the yard. I figured if someone was stealing our stuff, I'd catch them in the act. I didn't tell my parents because I didn't want them to think I was overreacting. That night, I stayed up late, sitting by the window with the camera feed on my laptop. The street was quiet, just the occasional group of kids in costumes walking by, laughing and carrying their candy bags. But then, around midnight, the motion sensor went off. My heart dropped when I saw the footage. The camera feed showed a figure dressed in all black, wearing a mask that looked like one of those cheap plastic ones you'd find at a Halloween store. They moved quickly but deliberately, heading straight for the remaining decorations. My stomach churned as I watched them grab the last of our pumpkins, the big one with the intricate carving my dad had spent hours on. I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The cold air hit me, and for a second, I hesitated. What if this person wasn't just a thief? What if they were dangerous? But before I could second-guess myself, I shouted, "Hey, what are you doing?" The figure froze, their head snapping toward me. Even from a distance, I could see the mass hollow eyes staring back, unblinking. They didn't say a word, just stood there for what felt like an eternity. Then in one swift motion, they turned and bolted down the street. I chased after them, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I ran. I didn't even think about the risk. I was too angry, too determined to find out who was doing this. But they were fast, and by the time I reached the end of the block, they were gone. I stood there, breathing heavily, my mind racing. Who would do something like this? And why? I checked the camera footage again when I got back inside, hoping for a clearer look at their face, but the mask made it impossible to tell who they were. The next morning, I reviewed the footage again, frame by frame. That's when I noticed something strange. The way the figure moved, it wasn't just familiar, it was too familiar. The way they tilted their head slightly to the left when they paused, the way their shoulders hunched as they ran. It hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew that posture, that gait. It was my neighbor, Mr. Carter. He lived just a few houses down, an older guy who always seemed friendly, if a little quiet. He'd even complimented our decorations earlier in the week. My mind raced. Why would he do this? What was he planning to do with all the stuff he stole? I didn't want to believe it, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. He'd been acting weird lately, always standing at his window, staring out at the street like he was waiting for something that I didn't tell anyone what I'd figured out. Part of me was still in denial, and part of me was scared of what might happen if I confronted him. But I couldn't just let it go. That night, Halloween night, I decided to follow him. I waited until it got dark, then positioned myself where I could see his house without being seen. Around 9 p.m., I saw him leave, dressed in the same black clothes and mask from the footage. He was carrying a bag, and I could see the faint outline of one of our stolen decorations poking out. My hands were shaking as I followed him, keeping my distance. He didn't go far, just an abandoned house at the end of the street, one that had been empty for years. The windows were boarded up and the yard was overgrown, but he walked right up to the front door like he owned the place. That's when I realized something even more chilling. The house wasn't empty anymore. Inside, I could see faint flickers of light, like candles, and hear the muffled sound of voices. Kids' voices. My stomach turned as I crept closer, trying to get a better look through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. What I saw made my blood run cold. Inside, the house was filled with our stolen decorations. The skeleton, the cauldron, the pumpkins, all arranged like some twisted Halloween display. But that wasn't the worst part. In the center of the room, a group of kids, no older than 10 or 11, sat in a circle, their costumes still on. They looked scared, their eyes wide and darting around the room. Mr. Carter stood in the corner, his mask still on, holding something in his hand. I couldn't see what it was, but the way the kids flinched when he moved made my skin crawl. I wanted to scream, to burst in and stop whatever was happening, but I was frozen. What if he had a weapon? What if I made things worse? I backed away slowly, my mind racing. I needed to call the police, but my phone was dead. I thought about running home to get help, but I couldn't leave those kids alone with him. I crouched behind a bush, trying to come up with a plan, when I heard the front door creak open. Mr. Carter stepped outside, still wearing the mask, and looked around like he was checking to see if anyone was watching. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't see me. After what felt like forever, he went back inside, and I heard the lock click. That's when I noticed something else, a small, open window on the side of the house, just big enough for someone to crawl through. I didn't know if I could pull it off, but I had to try. I had to do something that I moved as quietly as I could, my heart pounding so loud I was sure he'd hear it. The window was just a few feet off the ground, and I managed to pull myself up and slide through without making too much noise. Inside, the air was thick and musty, and the flickering candlelight made everything feel surreal, like I'd stepped into a nightmare. I could hear Mr. Carter's voice now, low and calm, but there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. He was talking to the kids, telling them some story about how they were part of a special game. I peeked around the corner and saw him holding a knife, the blade catching the light as he gestured with it. The kids were crying now, huddled together, too scared to move. I had to act fast that I looked around for anything I could use as a weapon or a distraction. My eyes landed on a stack of old books near the window. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I grabbed one and hurled it as hard as I could toward the far side of the room. It hit the wall with a loud thud, and Mr. Carter spun around, his mask turning toward the noise. "Who's there?" he growled, his voice sharp and angry. I didn't wait. I ran toward the kids, shouting at them to get up and run. For a second, they just stared at me, frozen in fear, but then one of them bolted for the door, and the others followed. Mr. Carter lunged at me, but I ducked and shoved him as hard as I could. He stumbled, and I took off after the kids, my legs burning as I sprinted toward the door. We burst out of the house and into the street, the kids screaming for help. Lights started flicking on in nearby houses, and I could hear doors opening as people came out to see what was going. Mr. Carter didn't follow us. He must have realized it was over. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. They searched the house and found all the stolen decorations, along with other things that made my stomach churn. Ropes, duct tape, and a list of names that included some of the kids from the neighborhood. I couldn't stop shaking as I gave my statement, replaying everything in my head. How long had he been planning this? How many kids had he been watching? The thought made me sick. The police never found him. It's been years now, and I still think about that night every Halloween. The decorations, the mask, the way he moved, it all feels like a bad dream, but I know it was real. I'll move away from that neighborhood, but I can't bring myself to put up Halloween decorations anymore. Every time I see a skeleton or a pumpkin, I think about that house and the kids who almost didn't make it out. I don't know what happened to Mr. Carter, and I don't want to know. All I know is that sometimes the scariest things aren't the monsters in the stories. They're the ones hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The neighborhood watch, it was Halloween night, and the neighborhood was buzzing with energy. Kids in costumes darted from house to house, their laughter echoing under the orange glow of streetlights. I was out with my younger brother, who was dressed as a pirate, and we were making our way down Maple Street. The air was crisp, and the smell of fallen leaves mixed with the faint scent of candy. Everything felt normal, festive even, until we reached the house at the end of the block. That's where I saw him. The scarecrow tea first. I didn't think much of it. It was Halloween, after all, and decorations were everywhere. But something about this one felt off. The scarecrow was standing in the middle of the front yard, its burlap face twisted into a permanent grin. Its arms were outstretched, and its tattered clothes fluttered slightly in the breeze. What really got me, though, was how still it was. Like, unnaturally still. I remember pausing for a second, staring at it, and feeling this weird chill run down my spine. My brother tugged on my sleeve, eager to move on, so I shook off the feeling and kept walking till we hit a few more houses, filling our bags with candy, and I almost forgot about the scarecrow. But as we looped back around to Maple Street, my brother pointed it out again. "Look, it moved," he said, his voice a mix of excitement and nervousness. I turned, and sure enough, the scarecrow was closer to the street now. Its position had shifted. It was no longer in the middle of the yard, but near the sidewalk, almost like it had taken a step forward. My stomach dropped. I told myself it was just a prank, maybe some kind of mechanical decoration, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to brush it off and keep going, but my brother was visibly spooked. He kept glancing back at the scarecrow as we walked away. I decided to cut the night short and head home, thinking it was better to be safe than sorry. As we passed the house one last time, I couldn't help but look at the scarecrow again. This time, I noticed something I hadn't before. Its head was tilted slightly, as if it was watching us. My heart started pounding, and I quickened my pace, pulling my brother along. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared, really scared. When we got home, I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just a stupid Halloween decoration. But later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way it had moved, the way it seemed to watch us, it didn't make sense. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was just a prank like I thought earlier, but what if it wasn't? What if someone was actually inside that costume, standing there waiting? The thought made my skin crawl. I finally fell asleep, but it was a restless, uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of sirens. My heart immediately started racing again, and I ran to the window. A police car was parked down the street, right in front of the house with the scarecrow. My stomach churned as I threw on some clothes and rushed outside. A small crowd had gathered, and I could hear people murmuring things like creepy and thank God they caught him. My blood ran cold when I overheard one of the officers talking to a neighbor. The scarecrow hadn't been a decoration at all. It was a man, a local predator, who had been using the costume to stalk kids in the neighborhood. He'd been standing there all night, watching, waiting, and he moved closer to the street because he was planning to grab someone. That I felt sick to my stomach as the reality sank in. That scarecrow, that man, had been so close to us. If my brother hadn't noticed it moving, if we hadn't decided to leave when we did, I didn't even want to think about what could have happened. I stood there, frozen, watching as the police led the man out of the house in handcuffs. He was still wearing parts of the scarecrow costume, the burlap mask hanging loosely around his neck. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and he looked like something out of a nightmare. I couldn't believe I'd been standing just feet away from him the night before. The officers explained that they'd received a tip from a neighbor who had noticed the scarecrow moving too. They'd been watching the house for a while, waiting for the right moment to intervene. Apparently, this wasn't the first time the man had done something like this. He'd been on their radar for months, but they never had enough evidence to arrest him, until now. Hearing that made me feel even worse. How many other kids had he watched? How many times had he stood there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the perfect opportunity? The thought made my skin crawl. For weeks after that, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. Every time I walked past that house, I felt a chill, like I was being watched all over again. The scarecrow was gone, of course, but the memory of it was burned into my mind. I kept replaying that night in my head, wondering what would have happened if we'd stayed longer, if we'd gotten closer. It was like a dark cloud hanging over me, and no matter how much I tried to shake it, I couldn't. My brother seemed to bounce back quicker, but I could tell it had affected him too. He didn't want to go trick-or-treating the next year, and honestly, I didn't blame him. The neighborhood changed after that. People started taking security more seriously, installing cameras and motion lights. The house where the scarecrow had stood was eventually sold, and the new owners tore it down to build something else. But even with all those changes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark had happened there, something that couldn't just be erased. To this day, I can't look at a scarecrow without feeling that same chill I felt that night. It's a reminder of how easily danger can hide in plain sight, how something so ordinary can turn into a nightmare in an instant that I never found out what happened to the man after his arrest. Part of me didn't want to know. I didn't want to give him any more space in my head than he already had. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself wondering about him, where he was, what he was doing, if he was still out there somewhere. Those thoughts always made me feel sick, like I was reliving that night all over again. I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, trying to push the images out of my mind, but they never really went away. Even now, years later, I can't fully explain what happened that Halloween. It was like a nightmare that bled into reality, something so bizarre and terrifying that it didn't feel real. But it was real, and the scariest part isn't just what could have happened. It's the fact that it could have happened to anyone. That man was there, in plain sight, and no one suspected a thing until it was almost too late. It's a reminder that sometimes the things that scare us the most aren't the monsters in the shadows. They're the ones standing right in front of us, hiding behind a mask. The stranger in the van, I was in the 7th grade when this happened. A pretty normal day, or at least it seemed at first. My friends and I had just finished school, and we were hanging out near the park like we always did. There was no real agenda, no supervision, just kids being kids. There was always this sense of freedom when we were out there, as if we were untouchable. We'd ride our bikes in circles, talk about the dumb stuff that mattered to us back then, like who was dating who in the class or which teacher was the worst out on that day. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty streets. We had just come up with some ridiculous dare involving the swings when we saw the white van pull up. It wasn't unusual for a van to drive by the park. People lived in those houses, and there was a little grocery store just around the corner. But this van was different. It was brand new, all clean and shiny, like it hadn't been driven much. I don't know why, but there was something unsettling about the way it stopped right across the street from us. The engine shut off with a soft click, and for a second, everything seemed to freeze. The driver was a man in his late 40s, maybe early 50s. He had a scruffy beard, like he hadn't shaved in a few days, and his clothes were all wrinkled, like he'd been sitting in the van for hours. At first, we didn't think much of it. He rolled down the passenger side window and gave us this smile that was way too wide. I remember it clearly. His teeth were too white, almost fake looking, and there was something off about the way his eyes never blinked. It wasn't like he was trying to be friendly. It was like he was studying us. "Hey kids," he called out, his voice kind of rough. "You guys want some candy?" At that point, we all kind of looked at each other, confused. It wasn't Halloween, and we were way too old to be taking candy from strangers. I could tell the others were already uncomfortable, but no one said anything right away. It wasn't like we were scared, not yet. We were just unsure. Maybe it was the fact that we'd always been told to avoid stuff like this, but we hadn't exactly been taught how to react. It was one of those moments where your gut starts telling you something's wrong, but you can't quite figure out why. One of my friends, Jared, who was always the boldest of us, took a step forward and squinted at the man. "What kind of candy?" he asked, his voice not as confident as he probably wanted it to sound. The man didn't answer right away. He just reached into the back of the van, and for a second, I swear I saw him looking at us through the rearview mirror. It felt like he was sizing us up, like he was deciding which one of us he wanted to talk to. When he turned back, he held up a bag of candy. But the weird thing was, it wasn't even regular candy. It was those little wrapped pieces, the kind you'd get from a bulk bin at a convenience store, and they looked kind of old, like they'd been sitting in that van for a while that I could feel the air shift in a way I can't really explain. It wasn't just me being paranoid. It was like the whole group had collectively realized that something was very off. Nobody spoke. We just stood there in this awkward silence, staring at the man who now had this weird, almost too patient look on his face. I felt this knot in my stomach tighten, and I could see the others shifting uncomfortably, looking around like they were trying to figure out what to do next. I remember trying to take a step back, but my legs felt like they were glued to the ground. That's when I heard the crunch of gravel behind me, and I turned to see our neighbor, Mr. Peterson, walking down the sidewalk toward US at MR. Peterson was an older guy, probably in his 70s, but he had this strange energy about him. You wouldn't think someone his age would have the courage to step into a situation like that, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made you feel like he could handle anything. He always wore this faded green jacket, and his boots made this distinct clicking sound on the pavement when he walked. That day, he had his cane in one hand, but his eyes were fixed on the van, and there was no mistaking the look of determination on his face. Without breaking his stride, he called out to the man in the van, his voice loud enough for all of us to hear. "You need to keep moving along, buddy. There are kids here, and you're making them nervous." The man's smile faltered just for a split second, but it was enough to make my heart race. He glanced over at Mr. Peterson, and for the first time, I saw a hint of something in his eyes, something cold. The van stayed still for a moment, like the man was deciding whether or not to argue. Then, without saying a word, he slammed the van into drive and sped off, leaving a cloud of dust behind. We were all still standing there, trying to process what had just happened. We stood there for a few moments, too stunned to speak. The only sounds were the faint hum of distant cars and the rustling of leaves in the wind. My heart was still pounding, my hands shaky as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I looked over at my friends, but no one seemed to know what to say either. Jared, who had been the most curious, was already talking to Mr. Peterson, thanking him for stepping in, but his voice was quiet, almost like he was trying to shake off the tension. MR. Peterson just nodded, his eyes still locked on the spot where the van had disappeared. "You kids are lucky," he said, his voice gruff. "That guy's been around here before. Not the first time he's tried something like that. You all need to be careful, okay? I could tell he was trying to keep us calm, but there was a weight to his words. The way he said it, like he knew more than he was letting on. For a second, I thought maybe he was going to say something else, but he didn't. Instead, he just turned and walked back to his house, his boots clicking louder now, like he was walking away from something that still made him uneasy that we didn't stick around much longer after that. We all made our way home, but the walk felt different. The air was thick with tension, and it was like the normal sounds of the neighborhood. Kids laughing, cars passing by, were all muted, like the whole world was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the image of the man's face, his unsettling smile, the coldness in his eyes. I kept replaying it over and over in my head, wondering what he had planned for us if Mr. Peterson hadn't shown up when he did. That night, I barely slept. Every little creak in the house, every gust of wind outside, made me jump. I kept thinking about the van, wondering if it would come back. The whole thing felt like a bad dream, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. It had been real, and I'd barely escaped whatever that man had in mind. I didn't tell my parents what happened. I didn't want to freak them out. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, watching, waiting. I don't know what would have happened if Mr. Peterson hadn't been there. It's a thought that still chills me to this day, that a few days later, I saw Mr. Peterson again while I was walking home. I was a little hesitant to approach him, but he waved me over, like he was expecting it. He didn't ask how I was doing or if I was all right. He just looked at me for a moment, like he was deciding if I was ready to hear something more. "You kids should stay away from that park for a while," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the street, making sure no one else was around. "I've been hearing things about that van. Not just here, but in other neighborhoods too." I nodded, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. I didn't ask him what he meant, and he didn't offer any more details. It was clear that whatever had happened wasn't something that was going to just disappear. I'd never seen that man again, and I never heard any more about him. But I stopped going to that park after that. It didn't feel like the same place anymore. It was like something had been broken, like the safety I'd always felt there was gone. I don't know if the man in the van was ever caught, or if he ever tried anything like that again. I'll never know. But every time I pass by that park now, I still feel that same uneasy feeling in my gut. And every time I see a white van driving by, I can't help but glance over my shoulder.